welcome everyone. My name is Emily Young. I'm the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego. And the mission of the Nonprofit Institute is to deliver action-oriented research and develop mission-driven leaders and organizations that go out and change the world, make it a better place. And we're very excited to have this partnership that we're building of thought leadership with the Bank of America to support and strengthen any number of nonprofit leaders and organizations that are doing fantastic things for our community to enhance our quality of life. And we're excited with this workshop with my phenomenal colleague, Dr. Zachary Green, who is the Director of Leadership in the Nonprofit Institute and a Professor of Practice within our Department of Leadership Studies at USD, to be kicking off a series of workshops. And they are aimed at supporting, of course, Bank of America grantees, along with community partners. And we're also super excited to have Bank of America associates that are joining us today. And we know that these are incredibly challenging times. I know the Nonprofit Institute, we have been surveying many of you to get a sense of what you're facing, what you're up against with not only a pandemic, but we also have an ongoing economic crisis. And of course, there have been many ongoing protests around Black Lives Matter and racial justice. And all of this, of course, influences the work that you're doing. So we're excited to have this today with Dr. Green. And the idea is really to support and strengthen your personal and professional work as we adapt to our new reality. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela Gabriel.
Thank you, Emily. We are so excited and proud to be partnering with you in this particular series. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pamela Gabriel, and I am the San Diego Market Manager for Bank of America, and it really is an honor to be here with you all today. As the Market Manager, I work with our local executives to deliver the bank's environmental, social, and governance committees for the San Diego's market by identifying, building, and growing community partnerships. With that little bit about myself, I definitely want to just touch on why we're here with you today. As Emily mentioned, over the several past months as a company and as a country, and I think just as in the whole world, we've all been faced with unprecedented times. We all, in our own way, have had our challenges with what is unfolding around us. Here at Bank of America, we see the impact of this in our communities, and we serve and understand that we need to do our part to help our communities thrive. As the needs of the local communities have continued to rapidly escalate, we have taken action to provide resources where there are gaps, help our local communities, especially with the most vulnerable populations. Earlier this year, we announced $100 million to support the coronavirus, and just recently, $1 billion investment over the next 4 years to address the economic and racial inequalities that are happening and have been accelerated by the global pandemic. We know that we must work together to address the current healthcare and humanitarian crises. Today, with that, we want to ensure that we also give you tools and resources to overcome the challenges that you are facing by becoming resilient in times of turbulence. With the uncertainty around us, we need to find ways to do this so that we can charge forward and support our community. We are honored to have this series, as Emily mentioned. This is the first of 4, so please be sure to tune in. I am really excited to have and listen to Dr. Zachary myself. I'll give a little bit more of an in-depth introduction for Mr. Zachary because we are really in for a special treat. He, as Emily had said, is the Professor of Practice and Leadership Studies as the Director of Leadership Initiatives at the Nonprofit Institute. He also is the lead faculty for the RISE Urban Leadership Fellows. A clinical psychologist by training, Zachary teaches courses and leads trainings on human development, organizational behavior, coaching, dialogue, negotiations, mindfulness, and love. As you can tell, he's an expert, and we are excited to have him with us today to bring this very impactful session to you. And with that, Dr. Green, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Pamela. Great, Gabriel. I really appreciate that. And thank you, and I look forward to our work today. As everyone has alluded to, both Emily and Pamela, that we are in these incredibly turbulent times. And sometimes, I don't know about you, but one of the things that happens with me is that in these turbulent times, I find it really very challenging some days to just know what I'm going to do next. So what we're going to do is we're going to go on a journey together. And in this journey, what we're going to be talking about is how do we face this both personally and professionally. So the way we're going to go through the day or through this next 90 minutes is to look at some of the factors that are creating the challenges that we're facing, because they're real. They're very real. We're in an unprecedented time. And then in addition to that, how might there be some ways that we can be more resilient? So let's begin to have that journey begin right now. So the first slide that we're going to see here is one that's going to speak to how we can really think about this as a time of turbulence, but also an opportunity for potential transformation. And how might we find this path for resilience? Because what we have here is a quote where, how are we to treat others? And what about the answer to that, which is, there are no others. In other words, we're in this together. And how might we go on this journey together? And so the next slide really speaks to, how do we then think about the journey that we're about to enter? So our work today is about the context which has been given to us by the introductions. Then we're going to talk about VUCA, which some of you probably already know this acronym and what that really means. We're going to look at then the fact that this moment is one of trauma and what that means to live amid trauma. And then that allows us to then pivot to resilience. And the new concept that's been emerging in terms of resilience is one of post-traumatic growth as a step towards that. And then how you, in terms of your own personal and professional process, can find more leadership resilience. So I hope that works as a way of doing this. And then you're going to be able to engage along the way through polls and through chats. And then near the end of this time, then there will be an opportunity for those of you who are present to actually be in a conversation with one another. So let's continue to begin to look at how this works. Some of you know the work of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. And what he tried to understand is that how he and others were able to survive another horrific time during World War II, and specifically those who were able to survive the Holocaust. And one of the quotes that I find really inspirational from him is that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So let's begin to think about that. We would love to believe, and many of us are walking around now believing that the situation is over, that we are back to normal. And because of that belief, we found ourselves amid a second surge in much of the country of the virus. So how do we then begin to deal with this challenge to ourselves? We're challenged to change ourselves. So let's begin to talk about some ways that we're going to do that. So the concept of VUCA is a really very powerful one. And what does it mean to live in a VUCA situation? One where there's resilience amid the turbulent time, this turbulent transformation we're in. The term VUCA actually stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I will get to that a little bit later. What we had is that this first slide really sort of speaks to that the world changed in the late 1990s because the notion of wars between nation states became less of an issue. And so the US Army College in the 1990s began to say, then what is happening in this post-Cold War? Because we're still finding ourselves in conflict. And then what they came up with was the acronym volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And then the 9/11 attacks confirmed that that was indeed what we were facing. But then this concept was then brought into deeper relief and deeper understanding in 2008 during the financial crisis, where again, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity was something that we faced. And now, in the face of the coronavirus, we find ourselves in this pandemic moment, and then this time of global unrest around issues of racial equity, we find ourselves again facing volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So this slide gives you a little bit more detail of what we're talking about. Volatility is the amount of rapid change that there is. So at 9/11, in 2008, and now in 2020, what we find is that things change rapidly. Remember back to the end of February and beginning of March when we began to move towards being sheltered in place, how the information changed literally from day to day about what we were facing. And what we were facing was indeed uncertain. There were many known unknowns of when we would go back to work. What was even the nature of the virus? And these kinds of things were constantly affecting us in one way or another. Then in addition to that, what we had was the complexity is then how do schools function? How do financial markets work? What is going on in terms of the disproportionate impact that this virus seems to have on different populations, the elderly, people of color? And then all of that there was so much ambiguity because there was information of different forms of where do we trust it and who do we trust and how do we know to go forward? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So no doubt you have some idea of what this means. And so we're going to ask you directly. So the next question is, right now, from your perspective, which VUCA condition is most present? So we're going to pull up a poll and you get to tell us. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. I'll give you about a minute. And uncertainty is taking the lead. It's followed by volatility. Oh, here comes complexity, but oh, uncertainty is really definitely in the lead. Okay, halfway through, uncertainty, volatility. Okay, we've got almost all of you have participated, a few more. Okay, about 10 more seconds. Those of you who've not, just give us an indication. This is anonymous. All we get is the aggregate. Okay, good. Good, and a couple more of you, and then we'll get a clearer picture. Okay, and then I think there are 2 more of you if you would like, because the picture's pretty clear right now, and that's it. Okay, so thank you so much. And what you're seeing is that most of us are seeing that in this moment, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity are present. But what we are really grappling with in this VUCA moment is the uncertainty. So thank you for participating in that, because it really gives us a sense of where we are and what uncertainty does in terms of how we are going forward. So now let's continue with this. Because when we're in a situation of turbulence, when we're in a situation of uncertainty, I really liked this from Scientific American, and that was just written at the beginning of the pandemic. And this quote is, "Trauma shakes up our world and forces us to take another look at our cherished goals and dreams. We tend to rely on a particular set of beliefs and assumptions about the benevolence and controllability of the world. And traumatic events typically shatter that worldview as we become shaken from our ordinary perceptions and are left to rebuild ourselves and our world." Now let's just look at that. And what I would ask you to do is that, in the chat function, this gives you an opportunity. And if you look at that set of words, what just sort of comes out at you? And so like when I look at it, I see the notion of cherished goals and dreams just pops out at me. Because amid all of this VUCA, amid all of this uncertainty, those are the things that pop out at me. So the chat is open. And then what set of words sort of pop out at you? Okay, and so I'm not going to ask you to do anything I'm not going to do, so I'm going to put that in myself. Okay, benevolence, controllability, shaken, shattered worldview, right? Controllability, traumatic. Yes, okay. Rebuild, worldview. Okay, a few more. Yes, traumatic, shatter, assumptions. Rebuild. Okay. I think I'm going to work from where we are with this, is because the notion of a world view and the rebuilding is in there, but there's also the notions of the fear, of the trauma, that all of these things are sort of hitting us at the same time. So thank you for participating in that. And so, and thank you for the person who just put in trauma, because that's where we're going to go next. So let's begin to talk about exactly that. See, in the face of this wonderful, political cartoon, it says, like, be sure to wash your hands and all will be well. But we also know that COVID has come in the second wave. You in banking and this larger community are also probably concerned about the economic uncertainty. We can put another wave in there in terms of the political unrest related to racial equity. And then there's the wave of climate change that is still looming and the implications going forward with that. And the potential of biodiversity collapsing. Some people have even begun to say that. And some even go as far as saying that, are we on the wave of a sixth extinction on the planet? And so all of that is in this. And so that really takes us to this question of, how do we then sort of cope with this? So the next slide speaks to trauma. Van der Kolk and Fissler are like the famous people on trauma. And they talk about an inescapably stressful event that overwhelms people's existing coping mechanisms. So think about yourself in the last 4-5 months since March 14th. And think about, have you had a moment of that? I don't know about you, I've had several moments of that. The next slide also speaks to another aspect of this, which is trauma is the unique individual experience of an event or of enduring conditions in which the individual's ability to integrate their emotional experience is overwhelmed, i.e., his or her ability to stay present, understand what is happening, integrate the feelings, and make sense of the experience, or the individual experiences subjectively of threat to life, bodily integrity, or sanity. Okay, now let's just think about that for a moment. Just for a moment. When we're in a pandemic, there is truly the potential of threat to life. Many of us have sufficient immune systems that we perhaps will survive the virus, but we're learning much more about how it works and operates and some of the lingering effects. So, and the sense of a body integrity is there. But what is really challenging is that people who are not used to a sense of isolation, of being by themselves for so long, or the lack of actual human touch and contact is influencing our sanity, not in the sense of going insane, but in terms of what it's doing to the kind of ways that we normally think about ourselves. So let's talk about how this goes even further. Okay, because if we think about it, then what really happens is that perhaps in the course of the last 5 months, what you've had is some moment where shock, denial, anxiety, unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, physical symptoms, or rumination have been a part of your experience. I know that from time to time, I don't know why, but I'm finding myself in the awake in the middle of the night. I also find that there are moments where, even though I have these loving relationships with my family, I find that there are strained moments that happen. And there are other times where I just don't want to believe that this is happening. So I want you to look at that slide, just look at that. And then which of these, if any, have you found yourself doing? And again, I'm not going to ask you to do anything I won't do, but I find that rumination is the one that I would prefer not to know that I have, but that's mine. What about you? What are some of the ones in terms of these symptoms? And if you haven't had any, that's great. But I would imagine that in the last 5 months, you've hit one of these. Yes, a lot of anxiety, lots of anxiety, lots of anxiety. Oh my goodness, the anxiety is coming through the screen. Yes, okay. You have the emotions. Some physical symptoms, right? Okay, thank you. Because what is really helpful about what is going on now is that when we put these forward, then it also tells us that we're not alone in this, that all of us are facing some aspect of that, which then confirms where we want to go with the next slide. Okay, because 70% of adults already have something that resembles trauma. Okay, 70%, that's just day to day. Because most of us think of trauma only in the form that is most severe, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, where those are the extreme cases, and we usually think about that in terms of people that are coming back from combat. But PTSD is not just the people that come back from combat. Those are also the people who are facing chronic situations that are unpredictable and feel as if they create the potential threat to life or bodily integrity or sanity. And if this is continuous, such as in child abuse, domestic violence, or that one accident that was so violent and unsettling, or people who have faced really dire situations in their family and unexpected death in a family, those things can lead to aspects or symptoms that resemble at least what is called acute stress disorder, if not post-traumatic stress disorder. Now this slide, the next part of the slide, the 90% of healthcare workers, that was before the pandemic. As hospitals begin to fill up, especially in the southern part of the United States and half of California right now, borders here between ourselves and Arizona, what we're beginning to see is that healthcare workers are facing this, and I would imagine that that number has increased. But some people are writing about that perhaps 100% of American citizens are now experiencing trauma through living through COVID and also dealing with the racial unrest and dealing with the economic uncertainty of this moment. And so how do we know that? So let's talk about that a little bit through the next slide. Because what we're beginning to say is that the way we understand trauma is not just a personal experience. So that's where we're starting here. We're also talking about it being vicarious, meaning that our witnessing of other people going through trauma because of the mirror neurons that we all have as human beings, then means that we empathically take on some of that trauma ourselves. So in addition to what we have seen around COVID and what that means in terms of most of us now know someone who's either contracted the illness, and what we're learning is that as many as 1 in 5 families knows somebody within their extended family who has become severely ill, and then others know people that have died. So as we've crossed this 145,000 people in this country who have died from the virus, the number of us who are likely to be 1 degree or 2 degrees of separation from someone who died is there. And so therefore the vicarious trauma of this moment is also there. But the vicarious trauma shows up another way, is that the reason that what happened in terms of the death of George Floyd was so powerful was because we were in this moment where it wasn't just a trigger moment, as many of the deaths of Black men who were unarmed before, but there was 8 minutes and 46 seconds of witnessing that. And with us all being closed in, then the vicarious nature of seeing this man's life taken from him in this kind of way created for many people a vicarious trauma, which then activated much of what we're seeing in terms of the unrest right now. The thing about COVID also is that it is a collective process. And what I mean by a collective process is it's not just me, it's not just you, but all of us are in this. And not only all of us here, but in much of the world, unless you live in New Zealand, have gone through a really difficult moment in terms of managing this virus for months and months at a time. And we here in the United States for even longer. But there's another piece that happens with this, is that sometimes there are certain populations that carry with them historical trauma that also is in this moment. And so then what you have is in the next slide, which points to this, because it points to you, where the personal, historical, vicarious, and collective trauma all hit at the same time. And some populations are more inclined to have all 4 of these happening right now. Some of us may have the personal piece, some may have the historical piece, some may have the vicarious, and some have the collective. And I would submit that all of us are having some level of the collective and vicarious. Some of us may feel less so the historical. But I'm not asking you in this chat to talk about you. I'm asking you, which ones are you in your circle around you seeing? So for me, I'm seeing all of them, but the one that I'm feeling right now much more is the part around the vicarious and the historical. Part of that is because I'm an African-American human being. And so therefore, and you will notice my slip that I put vicious instead of vicarious, because what it really speaks to is that the vicarious nature of this really feels like it's something I'm witnessing, but the historical pieces are being brought forward as well. And so as you're beginning to add in, you're beginning to speak to these as well. A lot of vicarious and collective, some historical, all 4, but collective and vicarious, a lot of vicarious, some personal and collective. Thank you very much. Okay, so it is that we know this. We know that this intersectional nature is there. And very few of us are just putting in one. We recognize that all of this. Oh yes, and those of you who provide the services for the community are constantly in the vicarious situation. And those who are on the direct lines are really experiencing that very directly. So if some more of you want to add in, that's great, but thank you for the voices that do speak to this. So intersectional trauma is not just trauma, it's not just VUCA, it is VUCA in addition to trauma, in addition to it being intersectional in its nature. So this is where we are. Let's take a breath for a moment. How you doing? Okay. When we are in the position of intersectional trauma, we're really going to notice a number of things that are going on concurrently. One of which is, just like you said, our ability to manage uncertainty is challenged. And the vast majority of you, and also me, are really grappling with the uncertainty of this moment. Because of intersectional trauma, not just trauma, but the intersectional nature, our thoughts become more unfiltered. We find ourselves not quite as able to hold in abeyance those thoughts that we find, less healthy. and our defenses begin to fall apart. And by that, I mean is that the sort of social norms which we walk around with, they kind of have a little fissure in them, a little bit of a crack. And then what really becomes problematic is that, you know, those demons that we have inside of ourselves that we try to hide, guess what? In the face of intersectional trauma, that stuff is normative in terms of showing up. And I could tell you some stories, but I'm just trying to present the material. But there are things about me that I thought I dealt with for years. I'm now grappling with again in the face of the intersectional trauma. So, okay, this is feeling kind of heavy, but let's try to figure out if we can get out of this a little bit. So let's see if there is a way. So, okay, some pathways. There are characteristic ways that we sort of respond to this. And sort of stay with me if you can. One of which is rejection, which is a fancy way of talking about denial. An easy way to cope with what is going on. And if we look around ourselves, we see people doing it all the time. The virus is not going to hit me. I'm young and resilient, or I don't believe it, or whatever. So there's a rejection. So that is a way to cope with this. And if there's confirmatory and socially reinforced evidence for that, rejection is a place to live. Now, repression is, I don't want to see it. It's like, let me not even pay attention to it's there. Now, my favorite way of dealing with this stuff is regression. Regression is going to an earlier aspect of your life as a way of sort of coping. It's a sort of like a sort of a soothing that you give yourself. And so yesterday I found myself drinking an orange soda. And that reminded me of when I was 6 years old and I would be with my grandfather and we would drink orange soda together. I haven't had one of those in years. But for some reason, that was just like the soothing that I needed. And then the other level is the reflection. That's that sort of higher level where we write and meditate and we become as one with ourselves. But I would imagine that we're dealing with all of these. So your next poll is that characteristically, which of these has been your COVID journey thus far? So I told you my real one is regression. I, of course, will put down reflection because that makes me look good. But I have really been living in the regression space. What about you? Good. Okay, so I want you to know that you are so far the most honest group that I've done this poll with so far. Because usually the reflection line is so far down the road that it's more than like 60 or 70%. And I don't want to negate that people do reflection. But what I'm saying is that a lot of the not wanting to deal with it and using ways of soothing are much more common in the face of trauma. And so what you are really offering here, and I thank you so much for that, is that a lot of us just would prefer not to even deal with this. And those of us who live in California who just 4 weeks ago thought we were on our way out of this, and then finding things shutting down around us again, it makes it really difficult to cope with this. So thank you so much. Okay, now, so you want to begin to get out of this? I do. So let's begin to find our way to resilience. Let's begin to recover from this. So this, in the face of trauma and oppression, in the face of the issues of racial justice on one hand and the issues of climate and all of that, we want to have resilience. So the way that my friends in the American Psychological Association talk about this is that resilience is, basically around bouncing back. So in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, we can add to that systemic racism and all those kinds of things. There is significant stress, and the American Psychological Association just did a recent volume of their journal that added to it the whole notion of a construct of racial trauma, which really looks like post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so then in addition to that, my preferred definition is the one that I want us to work with here. And my colleagues in Australia who are working with Resilience Consortium, listen to the difference here. It's not just about bouncing back, it's a different orientation. The capacity to manage the everyday stress. So notice that the emphasis is on the management of it, of life, while staying healthy, adapting, and learning from setbacks, to prepare proactively for future challenges. So in other words, what this one is about is that how do I position myself to be able to bounce back? It's much more of a preventive perspective as opposed to after the fact, then I need to bounce back. So my preferred definition of resilience is the one here, where how do we begin to get to a position where we can proactively bounce back in the face of our challenges? So let's figure out how we're going to do that. So the next slide really sort of begins to talk about that, because we know from research that there are certain resilience factors, and they are authenticity, purpose, adaptability, self-care, support, energy, and networks. And as you heard at the top, I am a professor, so I'm going to be professorial for about 3 to 4 minutes. And I'm going to go through each of the 7 of these. You know, I'm just a short version, okay? So Cynthia, let's go to the next slide. So when we talk about authenticity, and I want you to pay attention to each of these because you're going to have to choose one at the end of this where you're really strong already. So authenticity is like living authentically, literally like that. It means that you're close to your personal values, you're working from your strengths, that you have this emotional awareness and regulation. Basically, you have really strong emotional intelligence that you're able to bring. So you're living with congruence in who you are. So that's what that one's about. The next one is finding your calling. And this moment that we're in has really awakened for some people a greater clarity about making sure that their work is aligned with core values, and there's a sense of purpose, and that purpose is enjoined with a sense of belonging. The next one is about adaptability, but that really means not just adapting only. It also means the kind of quality of perspective that you bring, so that you're really focused on solutions, that you reframe these setbacks, that you really are not caught up in the negativity. It's an optimism that you're bringing to this. So the next set are mastering stress, and this is self-care, and that is sort of like dealing with the everyday stressors. And since work and life are right next to each other for most of us right now, then how do we assure that we have relaxation and recovery in a way that is healthy as opposed to regressive? And then support. Do we seek out advice from others and get feedback from people who also are grappling with this, but not in a way that drags us down and deeper into our hole on this, that really readily allows us to feel a sense of support from them? Next one is then the whole notion of energy. Staying healthy. This is really about the embodiment. This is about making sure that we're physically fit, that you're not drinking orange soda, okay? That you're really beginning to get that sleep. And these are the one, that's the one I need to work on, by the way. And then the networks. It is not just the sort of like the sort of like day-to-day work-life balance support, but it's really assuring that there's this web that supports us, that there are personal and professional relationships that allow us to perform optimally. So let's return to these now. So now that I've given you the little professorial lecturette on that, then the next slide is then, so which one of these are you already practicing? Because resilience is about starting from where you are and doing it really well. So which one of these are you doing really well? And I'm doing pretty well. So for me, it's purpose. Okay, so what's yours? some adaptability, authenticity, self-care. Great. Oh, some of you've got the self-care down. I want to talk to you. The networks, adaptability, purpose. Oh, well, I'm very impressed. Nice list. Authenticity and support, energy. Good. Couple more. Oh, some of you have them all down. That's good. Okay, pretty good, pretty good. I like this. This is wonderful. Okay, so what we're beginning to see is that a number of you already have a lot of these going on. That is absolutely fantastic. But keep this list in mind because I'm going to ask you the adverse later. I'm just letting you know. Okay, because what we need to talk about now is this wonderful concept that's coming out, which is about post-traumatic growth. So we've talked about post-traumatic stress disorder, we talked about racial trauma, we've talked about intersectional trauma. But what is it that allows us to really work creatively with trauma so that we can grow from it? Because we know that some people in the face of trauma actually do very well. You know, that what they're able to do is really have a strong sense of sort of moving forward. So let's talk about that a little bit. So post-traumatic growth is this. This is the ability of people who've experienced a highly life-threatening or traumatic event to maintain relatively stable, healthy levels of psychological and physical functioning. And what most of you did, and just showed us in the chat, that at least in one of these ways, you're already doing that. And so what you are affirming is what the research on post-traumatic growth is actually showing, that the capacity for resilience is actually pretty strong. And that it doesn't mean that there's a simple absence of psychopathology. It is a proactive stance towards dealing with adversity in such a way that we can get there through multiple routes. And I gave you 7 different routes of what that is. And some of you already said, I'm doing pretty good on a lot of those. And some of you identified multiple ones of those. So I only asked you to do one, but it really means that in the face of adversity, there's adaptation where you actually directly confront the disruption. So if you think about that and you think about yourself, how are you facing this disruption? And so let's continue to think about that. Okay, so the next slide sort of says, some of us, even though we're facing this, can feel broken, but I want to give you a beautiful metaphor that I learned about a few years ago. Some of you might know about kintsugi already. Kintsugi is this centuries-old Japanese practice where you take a piece of pottery and it's been shattered and it looks broken. We often would just sort of throw it out and get rid of it. But suppose it's something that was already precious to you. So this practice is that you take all the shards, the different pieces of this brokenness, and then the technique really means bringing them together, and you join the pieces. But what you do is you use gold, silver, platinum, and then you put it back together. And then what you have is something that's beautiful, beautiful, but the legacy of the brokenness is still there. Post-traumatic growth is about that. You can see now what this kintsugi looks like in the bowl that's in front of you there. Is that it really is about bringing it together so that there's a beauty to it, but the legacy of the history of that moment of brokenness is there, because most people would prefer not to have the trauma. And indeed, what we also are learning from the research is that people do better with the positive events than aversive events, or adverse circumstances. And the reason that post-traumatic growth, it works, but it's a two-step process. First, you have to adapt to the fact that you had the adverse situation or the traumatic event. And then the second part that you have to do on top of that is then you have to transform it And so therefore, what happens, even in the face of post-traumatic growth, something that we're able to bring forward, there's also another aspect of it, is that if the trauma is triggered again, then a lot of the emotional resonance of it also returns. We recover faster, but nonetheless, it sort of drives us back into that space. So what is important to know is that we have this because our resilience orientation works this way. And I want you to begin to now do a shift, because we're going to be having a conversation pretty soon about how this works, is that I want you to begin to identify for yourself, what are the immediate stressors that I'm having in this moment of uncertainty? What are some of the stressors that I am facing right now in this uncertainty? And the next part is then, I want you to think about the sort of current coping modes that you have. Most of you have some really rather exceptional coping things that, you know, and in addition to a positive attitude, you have all of these other factors. And then I want you to begin to think about, what are my potential routes to resolution? Or potential routes to resolution, okay? So how do we begin to engage this in terms of healthier practices? So can I see the next slide? Because I think I want to do this differently than I originally planned. Okay, so what I want you to look at this is that these are things that allow for growth from adversity. And what we're going to do here is I want you to look at those. See them? Okay. And I want you to think about, okay, how would I go about doing that? And what I would like you to do is just to write down something from this list here. And if those don't fit you, then figure something else out. We had the 7 earlier, and then, well, we have this. And not in the chat, but for yourself to write down which of these are you finding are true for you. Greater appreciation for life, appreciating and strengthening your close relationships, compassion and altruism, identification of new possibilities, greater awareness, deeper sense of purpose in life, enhanced spiritual development, growth in creativity or artistry. Just write down one of those. Say, okay, if you don't have it fully, then have it be aspirational, something that you would like to have. Okay. And again, you don't need to put these in the chat. It's just for you to write them down for yourself, because we're going to use that in a moment. Okay. Now let's take it to the next slide, please. Because what we're going to do soon is we're going to enter a conversation. And don't worry if you put it in the chat. I appreciate you sort of continuing to be engaged in that way. Because we're going to have a conversation on personal and professional practice. And so let's move to what that would look like. Okay. So when we're engaged with this, there's a process that's called EAR. Because you engage, you assess, and you renew. So what I'm inviting you to begin to do now is then think about the strengths that you have. And then think about how you would want to assess the progress, because to have the strength but without any kind of sort of measure, it's just something that's like a pipe dream. And so what we want to do is really get to the point where you would determine the gap between where you are now, where you want to be, because that is what allows you to renew your resilience. So what is it that you want to engage, and how are you going to assess it? And then wherever you are right now, write that down as well. So you have the 7 factors that sort of are part of resilience. We know that there are adaptations that we have in post-traumatic growth. And you're beginning to identify those things. So you're beginning to create for yourself a menu of ways to begin to work with this. Okay? So you have those. So what you will have is that what we know already is that deliberate rumination, as opposed to the kind that wakes you up in the middle of the night. So, well here. And that means that we're beginning to set intention. So one of the things that you want to do from a personal perspective is then how do you do that? Is to begin to change the nature of your relationship so that you are making these positive steps and that you're creating perceptions of new possibilities with one another and within yourself. And that's where expressive writing comes in. And this is sort of getting to a point where you have this stressful or traumatic situation, but you're able to place it literally somewhere in terms of your writing. But you have your own practices. And so what we're beginning to do is identify those practices. And I want to give you a tool that's a specific practice, and that's called the 10-word intention here. And so let's go to the next slide. And what do I mean by a 10-word intention? A 10-word intention is exactly that. It is coming up with 10 words that will remind you from a very personal perspective what it is that you can do to sort of keep this learning alive for yourself. A workshop like this is wonderful in terms of its immediate feeling, but in terms of the actual shift in behavior, it really requires something that we can sustain with it. And so a 10-word intention would be sort of like from recent workshops, begin each day asking the question, what is most important? Exercise excellence, love family, add value, model justice, be present. Another one, courageously face the challenge of being authentically transformational right now. So I'm going to keep these up for a moment. And so you will have, I'll give you 2 minutes. Play around with it. And if you have 7 words, if you have 9 words, you have 11 words, don't worry about that. More, try to find the essence of what you've learned or what you're relearning right now. And then place it in a 10-word intention for yourself. So 2 minutes. Okay, take another minute. Okay, about 30 more seconds. And if you have yours and if you want to, knowing that this is a public space, you can offer it for others. And if not, just keep it for yourself. No requirement. But it really is important to allow yourself to do this exercise and to find what those 10 words are for you. And thank you to those of you who are offering some of yours. These are beautiful. Thank you, people. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So this workshop is about leadership resilience. And as more of these come in, the notions of love, compassion, community, integrity, passion, grace are beginning to show up. And you could have written the article from the Harvard Business Review that I'm about to present to you, because in it, what it speaks to is exactly these kinds of things. Is that, so if we look at when you're working with a team, and many of you are leaders of teams or facilitate teams or are part of teams, we know that there are factors that really help along those lines. And so let's talk about first, what are the facilitating factors? And so some of the facilitating factors are, how much are you really bringing forward confidence? First in your own abilities, but how much are you encouraging others to discover their own confidence in their abilities? The next one is around disciplined routines. One of the challenges of going virtual for many of us, and the sort of the distance learning in schools and all of this remote work, is the sort of disciplined routines for our work. And some people need support around that. So are you providing that kind of focus? And presence of social and family support. Some families have the 5-year-olds and the 7-year-olds running behind. My teenagers are fortunately downstairs, and I told them they can't play Minecraft and what is the other one? They play Fortnite while I'm doing this, so that I would have had sufficient bandwidth. But that was a negotiation. But that's a part of making sure that there's family and social support. So where are you putting the priority on that connection? But I'm not talking about just you. I'm talking about the people with whom you work. So I want you to just choose one of these for the next, I don't know, week, month, where one of these sustaining factors are ones that you are going to work with. Let's go back to the previous slide, the facilitating factors first. Yeah, one of these, choose one of these first. Level of confidence and abilities, discipline routine, presence of social and family support. So choose one and write it down. That, okay, I can work on this. I can work on this. And so for me, it's right now, I need to work on discipline routines. I have so many things that are going on that sort of discipline and focus is going to be needed for the next probably 6 weeks. And so that's the one that I'm going to be working on. But, you know, for you, not in the chat, but just for yourself, write it down. And now that's what facilitates. And then I'm also going to be working with that in terms of the teams that I'm a part of, and already members of the teams that I'm a part of are doing this very disciplined work. The next part, though, is then where we were going, which is the sustaining factors. How do we then grade? We facilitate the things that build our teams in this virtual moment. But how much are we doing each of these? Many of your 10-word intentions spoke to this. Are we displaying compassion? In other words, are we offering care first? Do we check in with people about how they're doing as a routine part of it? I mentioned the families that have all of these, you know, different demands that are going on concurrently. In a few weeks, there are going to be parents that are going to be homeschooling and dealing with being in the office and trying to be productive, all in the same space and time. And so in what ways are we making accommodations for those situations? And also accommodations for those people who are now going on 5 or 6 months of really being sheltered in place, and the sort of loneliness and the absence of contact and what that does to people. Are we making accommodations and inquiring into the challenges that are faced there? And finally, are we guiding difficult conversations? Guiding difficult conversations, so that we're modeling genuine concern about the circumstance that people find themselves in. So I would ask you to figure out which one of these is yours. And for me, it's I can do the other two pretty well, but it's the guiding the difficult conversations and sort of staying present to those. And then write that down for yourself. Okay. Now, what should have happened is that you should have a 10-word intention that is in draft form, at least. you have some factors in terms of resilience and post-traumatic growth that you're holding on to personally. And so all of that is present, and none of this really sustains itself without conversation. And with that, we are right at the end of our time. And I want to thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Pamela Gabriel for whatever words of wisdom she has as we close.
Well, thank you. And I first and foremost just want to thank you, Mr. Zachary Green, for all of your support and your wonderful knowledge today. I hope everyone has taken, it sounded like everyone has taken some great notes, and we really appreciate you providing this for us, both you and Emily. So
Thank you so
thank
much.
you so much.
Okay, so with that, our work ends, but our work towards resilience for ourselves and for those that we love continues. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.